much digital day. We are living in some pretty scary times, and a lot of people have dread for what else might be coming around the corner. But I'm here to say that I think there's reason to be cheerful. You see, sometimes when things get a little bit disrupted, they can go two different ways. They can be broken, or they can be broken open. And I think that's what's coming for us in the future, a breaking open of our existing society for something better in the future. If we look back on the Second World War, one of the most troubling and awful times in human history, mass migrations and starvation, as well as awesome and terrifying weapons. This was a very new world with such challenges that we'd never faced before. But we responded to those. We came up with new institutions for dealing with those kinds of problems. Institutions that had the capability of coordinating and creating new forms of trust required to deal with these problems. Today, we have new ways of dealing with horrible disasters. We've responded to these. We've rebuilt our lands, literally, in order to safeguard against these kinds of problems. Our new institutions and our new bravery in facing very difficult challenges enabled a new world. A world where the crucible of change and challenge had enabled a stronger and better society. That was quite an achievement. Now it's 75 years later. In some areas, a few cracks are starting to show. And some of this is because our institutions are big, monumental edifices. And those monolithic institutions tend to be slow moving. And they are propped up by a few key points. And if one of those breaks, then those cracks can start to spread. But I think we have an opportunity to reform our institutions as well as to build fantastic new ones. One of the reasons for why institutions sometimes get a little bit slow over time is that regulations build up over time. Those rules that were made maybe decades ago are still on the books. But I'm concerned about things like refactoring. Refactoring is an idea that comes from the world of software. It's about taking things that are very complex and reforming them to make them simpler again. We have a tremendous opportunity to apply the same idea of refactoring to the world of law, legislation, and regulation. And we can use AI to help us to do this. We can, in fact, use the latest developments in artificial intelligence, such as GPT-3, in order to turn very complex legal language into the sorts of language that most people can understand without challenge. We can do something similar for our regulations. We can make them simpler, and we can make them streamlined. And we have other opportunities too, because we can take our institutions, which are single points of failure in Brussels or The Hague or New York, and we can start to decentralize or even to create distributed institutions in new ways. One of the reasons for this is that the price of sending a kilogram to orbit has absolutely precipitated massively. And this gives us amazing new capabilities. We can understand the world in new ways. Here, for example, a Dutch and American team is using satellites to track pollution, not just on a country scale or a city scale, but to understand individual emissions from individual factories, power plants, drilling, etc. So we can pinpoint who is doing what and take steps to prevent or at least make them pay for it. We can do more. Because getting to orbit is now so cheap, we can put very sophisticated satellites in orbit in tremendous abundance. And we're now giving broadband to everyone on Earth, very high speed broadband too. This means that we can connect our entire globe so much more easily than before. There's not going to be a patch, a single meter of our planet where people live that isn't connected to these networks. This will help us as well to travel virtually, to use robotic avatars, to explore the world, to do work, and to care for our loved ones from afar. This is something so important in a time of pandemic like we have today. The technology in this space is advancing very quickly. Already, we have cafes which are staffed by people who are completely bedbound, but by inhabiting one of these avatars, they are able to explore their world and do meaningful work for other people. We can use these kinds of technologies to inspire hope in other parts of the world, to help people who may feel as if they don't have hope where they come from, but by joining these global networks, by doing meaningful work in perhaps another part of the globe, they can bring that money back to where they are and enrich their own societies in ways that maybe weren't possible before. This gives hope, and hope is one of the most essential ingredients for any society, and especially in these times. It is this kind of hope which is fueling initiatives such as the Great Green Wall, which is uniting Africa straight from the west to the east coast to create a belt of greenery to not only stop the Sahara Desert, but rather to reclaim it, to turn it green again as it once was. And it's this kind of great vision for the future that we are building today as a species that I want you to hold on to, because I want you to think of these times as one of the greatest opportunities for learning our species has ever had, our entire human species. We may look at these times in despair, or we can understand that wisdom is found on the far side of suffering. We're riding a roller coaster, and it's up to you to choose which perspective you're going to take. And I invite you, who are more like the woman on the right, who are able to feel exhilarated, that's when you're excited as well as being a little bit terrified too, to share that with others, who feel no hope for the future, to give them that strength and that confidence that we as a species are going to be okay, and that our societies will endure as they have done before. That's the future we're building towards, all of us, through these new digital technologies. That's something that I want you to participate in. So thank you for being here.
That was a nice touch, yeah. Well, I salute you back, Nell. Thank you so much for opening of our conference with such an inspiring talk. How was the feeling to talk to us using a technology like video conferencing?
Well, I would much rather prefer to be directly there in the studio. Unfortunately, circumstances mean that would be very difficult for me, but we adapt. We adapt as we always have as a species when times are tough or challenging. We find new ways of doing things, and sometimes we learn that those new ways are pretty useful and we can apply them in ways that maybe we hadn't been brave enough to do so before.
You're so right. I like that attitude. Let me just ask a question that was sent in. It's a question about science. Are you surprised or disappointed that science hasn't come up with a cure for COVID so far?
I think that the cure is probably better found in preparing our territory, in making ourselves more resilient to the virus if we do happen to come across it. So that means, for example, making sure that everyone in society has enough vitamin D in their bloodstream. So in the past, lots of people had problems with goiters, these big puffy balls that would grow on people's thyroids because they weren't getting enough iodine. And yet we put iodine in salt and we made that problem disappear forever. And I think we have opportunities to be brave as we were in the past, like our wise ancestors, and ensure that everyone is getting enough vitamins to prepare their territory for the virus if it happens to meet them.
Right. So resilience, preparations, always important. Then you also touched upon GPT-3 in your presentation. Again, the same question. Were you surprised? Were you happy? Are you afraid that this technology is now openly available for people who get access to the API?
I think GPT-3 is a very significant advance in AI. And I liken it to deep learning, which arrived somewhere around 2011 or so, when people realized that throwing lots of data at a problem actually was very useful. And you had a ridiculous positive return by introducing AI to lots of data. Here it's similar, but it's about introducing AI to lots of parameters, basically having really big models. So instead of throwing data, we're throwing compute. But that works, and that's making surprisingly beneficial returns. I am a little bit afraid of how these technologies can be used to generate false information, to maybe gaslight people into believing things that they otherwise shouldn't, or create content which people think is made by a certain person, but maybe is made entirely by machine. However, just as we dealt with problems of atomic energy in the past, we will find ways of dealing with these kinds of problems with AI too. There will be a few stumbles along the way as we learn, but that's the nature of the game. Sometimes learning just requires jumping in the pool and flailing around until you figure out how to swim.
What a cool answer. Thank you so much, Nell, again for joining us via this technology, and thank you for giving your positive perspective.